Welcome to today's session hosted by the London School of Emerging Technology. I'm Kelly, and it's a pleasure to have all of you joining us for another edition of our Founder Growth Series. Whether you're developing your first startup, preparing to launch a product, or already navigating the challenges of a growing business, today's discussion is incredibly relevant because every founder eventually reaches a moment where they ask themselves a difficult question. Should I keep going in the same direction, or is it time to change course? Many people believe successful entrepreneurs simply refuse to give up. But if we study the world's most successful startups, we find something different. The best founders don't succeed because they never change direction. They succeed because they know when to change direction, and just as importantly, how to do it without losing momentum. Today's session is called the Startup Pivot Playbook, knowing when to change direction without losing momentum. And we'll explore how founders can recognize the right signals, avoid common mistakes, and make strategic decisions that strengthen their businesses rather than weaken them. To guide us through this conversation, I'm delighted to welcome today's speaker, Amy Kohl. Amy has worked closely with founders and early-stage businesses, helping them navigate the realities of building companies in uncertain markets. She understands that startups rarely follow a straight line, and today she'll share practical insights into when a pivot is necessary, when it isn't, and how to approach these decisions with confidence. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we dive into the topic, could you briefly introduce yourself and tell our audience what inspired today's session, please?
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. So obviously for those who haven't met before, I'm Amy Kohl, and I work with founders and startup teams by supporting them to move from their very early stage ideas to then creating a successful business. And one thing that I've learned over the years is that startups rarely fail because the founders obviously lack the passion. Most founders are incredibly hardworking and they care really deeply about their product. And they're also willing to put in the long hours. The real challenge is that the passion can sometimes make it feel difficult to recognize when the market is actually asking us to change. So today's webinar isn't about encouraging everyone to pivot. It's actually one of the biggest misconceptions in entrepreneurship is that pivoting is always the answer. And sometimes you absolutely need to stay on the course. But then there are times where changing direction is the smartest decision that you'll ever make. The key is learning about how to tell the difference between the two. So throughout today's session, we'll work on practical examples, we'll look at founder scenarios and real business challenges, and then there'll be some interactive exercises that'll help you think like a strategic founder rather than just simply reacting to the problems as they appear. So my goal is simple. By the end of this webinar, I want you to leave with a practical framework that helps you make a smarter business decision, whether you're just starting out or you're in the kind of scaling phase. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm really looking forward to this session. Please share your thoughts as we go, and if you're watching later on LinkedIn or wherever you're watching, I'll be around in the comments to talk to you about your interactions.
Brilliant, fantastic introduction, Amy, thank you. And I completely agree. Today isn't about changing direction just for the sake of it. It's about learning how to make better strategic decisions. So let's begin with a question that I like anybody who watches this to think about. Are you climbing faster or climbing smarter? So just have a look at the question on your screen. If your startup doubled its revenue tomorrow, would you still be building the same product? Take a moment, don't answer it too quickly, and just have a good think about it. If your revenue suddenly doubled overnight, would you continue building exactly what you're building today? Or would your priorities change? If you're watching this, have a think about whether you would use the same product or a different product. And if you're watching live, pop it in the chat.
Yeah, I really like this question because it goes back to the kind of working hard, not working hard, but working smart. And it really forces you to think really differently. Most founders measure progress by asking themselves, how fast are we growing? But it tends to be the wrong question. The better question is how are we growing in the right direction? So I want you to imagine this little scenario. You're climbing a mountain, you're climbing incredibly fast, you're working a lot harder than everyone else, you invested more money in your kit, your gear, and you're building more features. But if you're climbing the wrong mountain, every step towards that actually takes you further away than where you truly want to be. And that's what happens to many different startups. They become experts at the execution before they're certain that they're solving the right problem. So when revenue increases, founders often assume that they're on the right path, but revenue alone doesn't tell you the full story. You might be attracting customers through heavy discounts, or you might be spending twice as much on marketing to maintain that growth. Or perhaps one of the features is driving all of the value whilst the rest of your product is actually rarely used. And these are very different in different businesses. Even the revenue looks similar. One of the biggest lessons I've learned from working with founders is that growth doesn't automatically equal validation. Sometimes growth confirms your strategy, and other times it hides a lot deeper issues that only become visible much later on in the process. So today's session is about helping you recognize those differences before they become really expensive mistakes.
That's such an interesting perspective because many of us naturally associate growth with success. But as you've highlighted, Amy, not all growth is healthy growth. Sometimes it can actually distract founders from the real challenges inside the business. So before we explore how to recognize those situations, let's start with the fundamentals. Moving on to what is a startup pivot? The term pivot is used constantly in the startup world. We hear it in podcasts, we hear it from investors, and we read up in startup success stories. What does it actually mean? Amy, could you help us understand what a startup pivot really is, and perhaps just importantly, what it isn't?
Absolutely. So let me start with a definition of pivot. So a startup pivot is a deliberate change in the business strategy based on evidence, whether that evidence comes from customer feedback, changing of the market conditions, or just generally new opportunities. So we need to notice one really important word in that definition, and that's the deliberate part. So a pivot is not necessarily a pain reaction. It's not about abandoning your entire business because something becomes really difficult. And it's definitely not changing direction every time a competitor launches a brand new feature. Instead, this pivot is a strategic decision that is made after learning something really important from your customers or your market. And I often describe it as this: a pivot changes the path, but it absolutely doesn't change the end destination. So your mission will stay exactly the same. Your purpose will stay exactly the same. But the change is in the strategy of how you achieve that mission and that purpose. So the next question is, when should a founder actually consider pivoting? There are several different signals of when to kind of realize that you need to pivot. Perhaps maybe customers love one feature but ignore the rest of the product, or maybe your marketing budget keeps increasing but the revenue hasn't stopped growing, or perhaps customer expectations have changed and your product or solution no longer fits their needs as they once did before. So sometimes an entirely new market opportunity emerges that's often more attractive than the one that you originally targeted. And in some cases, the business model itself just sometimes isn't suitable for the long term. And these aren't necessarily a sign of failure. They're just signals that deserve a little bit more investigation. So why is this really important? Because a well-executed pivot can help you achieve a much stronger product market fit, and it prevents you from wasting really valuable time and money, and obviously the energy that it takes to use a strategy that no longer serves your business. It allows you to adapt as customers and the market evolve, and it opens the door to new growth opportunities as well. And most importantly, it helps businesses build that resilience, enough to survive that change rather than just be really disrupted by it. So founders often think that consistency means never changing. And I see that a little bit differently. The strongest founders are the ones that are consistent in their vision, but they're very flexible in their strategy. And that's the mindset that I want you to have throughout today's session.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's finish this section with a quick question for anybody watching this video. Looking at the reasons Amy has shared, which one do you think causes the greatest number of startup pivots? A, customer feedback. B, market changes. C, revenue challenges. Or D, new opportunities. If you're watching online, pop your answers in the chat, and any other answers we get, we'll revisit later. So now that we understand what a pivot is and why it matters, let's put ourselves in the shoes of a founder. On our next slide, Amy is going to introduce us to a startup that believed everything was going perfectly until the warning signs became impossible to ignore.
Yeah, so as you listen to this story, I want you to think as a CEO. Don't just observe the business. I want you to ask yourself one question. So the startup that didn't know that they needed to pivot.
Amy, you've prepared a fictional startup called TaskFlow AI. At first glance, it looks like a success story. As everyone follows along, I'd encourage you not to think like an audience member. Think like a founder, or even better, think like an investor sitting in a board meeting. Amy, tell us the story.
Cool, thank you, Kelly. So, like I said, I want you to imagine this startup actually belongs to you. You spent the last 2 years building it. You've obviously sacrificed your weekends. You've convinced your family that this idea is going to work. You've hired the people. You've raised the investment. Now, let's see what happens. So the fictional company is called TaskFlow AI. It's an AI-powered project management platform designed for small businesses. The founders genuinely believe that they've built something valuable. So now we need to look at year one. 8,000 people have registered, and the startup wins a competition. It raises £500,000 in seed funding. The media begins writing about the company. If you were one of the founders, how would you feel? Probably excited, confident, maybe even convinced that you've achieved product market fit. And that's exactly how most founders feel.
And honestly, Amy, if I saw those numbers, I'd probably think the company was doing brilliantly.
Exactly. So this is where the danger kind of begins. Success often creates the confidence, which is great, but the confidence doesn't always create clarity. So now let's move on to hypothetical year two. Website traffic doubles, the team triples in size, and 3 new features of the product is launched. Everything still looks really positive, but now we need to look a little bit more carefully. Something changes. Customer renewals begin failing. Customers only use one of the features. Sale conversions become longer. And we need to notice something different. These problems don't obviously show up in headlines. No one writes an article of, congratulations, your customer retention has quietly declined. And the warning signs of all of this are usually quite silent. Even to the founders, they don't notice them because they're focused on the visible growth.
Yeah, it's understandable, isn't it? So yeah, if you're watching this, I'd like everyone to answer this question honestly. Looking only at year two, would you have continued building exactly as planned? So just have a think about whether that's a yes or a no, and if you're online, just pop it in the chat.
So obviously some of you are going to say yes, and some of you are going to say no. Both of those are equally understandable, because this is exactly where founders face one of the hardest decisions in business. Do we stay patient or do we change direction? So let's move on to year 3. The revenue stops growing. Cash runaways stops to 6 months. And finally, the founders decide to interview the customers. And this is where everything starts changing. The customers don't say your product is bad. Instead, they say, we only came here for the AI meeting minutes. And imagine hearing that after spending 2 years building 5 completely different products. And that one sentence should change everything. The startup wasn't failing because of the technology. It was failing because it solved 5 problems when the customer only wanted 1.
It's such an important lesson, isn't it? Especially when you've had an idea and then, it doesn't quite work out. And the founders weren't ignoring the customers intentionally. They just simply assumed that more features meant more value.
Yeah, and that is one of the biggest startup mistakes. Founders often ask, what else can we build? Like, what else can we launch? And customers are asking, why are you making this so complicated? And they're 2 completely different conversations.
Yes, they are indeed. So now we've seen how easy it is to miss the warning signs. But even when founders realize something needs to change, many still resist pivoting. Why is that?
I think it's because founders have often been taught the wrong story. We've always been told that persistent always wins, to never quit, to never change direction, to keep pushing. But here's the truth. So persistence without learning isn't resilience, it's just purely stubbornness. So let's have a look at some of the biggest myths. Pivoting means you failed. And actually, pivoting means you've learned something from your original assumption that you didn't account for. So failure isn't changing direction, failure is just refusing to learn. So myth 2 is you should only pivot when your business is failing. And that's absolutely not true. The best founders pivot when they still have cash, they have time, they have customers, and they still have lots of options. So waiting until you're desperate usually means that your choices have become a lot smaller. Myth 3 is a pivot means changing absolutely everything, and this is not the case at all. Sometimes you keep the same team, the same technology, even the same customers, and the only thing that does change is your strategy. And a great pivot protects what's already working. Myth 4 is more customers means that you're always succeeding, and that's not necessarily true. If your customer acquisition grows, but your retention is failing, you're filling a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Growth without retention just isn't sustainable for your business. Myth 5 is customers will tell you exactly what to build. They won't. All they do is explain their problems, and it's your responsibility as a founder to design those solutions, and that is essentially your job. And then finally, myth 6 is pivoting is one big decision. And again, this is not true. The strongest startups evolve continuously. There's small improvements, small adjustments, small experiments, instead of kind of reinventing the whole wheel and have one dramatic reinvention.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, just another point for anybody watching this to consider. Which myth do you think founders believe most often? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? And if you're watching live and want to pop it in the chat, we can discuss your answers shortly.
I've worked with lots of different founders that believe every single one of those myths. But the myth that I encounter the most is actually number 2. People wait until everything's broken, and by then the market's moved on, the money's gone, and the team has really lost confidence. Those pivots have to happen early, and we don't want emergency pivots because they happen far too late.
So I guess the obvious question becomes, how do you actually know when it's time? So everyone, it's your turn for the next few minutes. You're the CEO.
So here I am. I'm going to place 5 reports on your desk. Imagine that these 5 have just arrived before your monthly board meeting. So report 1 says, new signups continue increasing. Obviously fantastic, but only 28% remain active after 90 days. Most people only use one feature. So the question is your customer acquisition really your biggest achievement, or is customer retention your biggest problem? Report 2, revenue is growing. Sounds great, but acquiring each customer now costs twice as much. Profit margins obviously shrink. Would you celebrate this or would you worry about this? Report 3. Customers repeatedly tell you, we love the AI meeting summaries, but we just don't use the rest. And this might be the most valuable feedback that you'll ever receive because your customers are literally showing you where to move your business into. Report 4. Competitors launch smaller, simpler, more focused products and they're growing faster. You need to ask yourself, are you going to copy their strategy? Are they copying your strategy, or are they exposing your weaknesses? And finally, report 5. Founders say, let's build 3 more features. We need to notice something. Every report points in one direction, and then the founders point in another.
Yes, that is happening. I'd like everyone to answer, if you're watching this, how many reports would need to be read before you seriously considered a pivot? 1, 2, 3, 4, or all 5? Have a think about it, and if you're watching live, pop your number in the chat.
So this is my favorite question because most people kind of answer 4 or 5, and that's exactly why startups pivot far too late. Great founders don't wait until every single signal turns red. They recognize the patterns early on. 1 warning sign can be a coincidence, but 5 warning signs are the evidence, and that's the difference. So if today's session leaves you remembering just one thing, remember this. A startup rarely fails because it's lacked effort. It fails because the founders keep solving yesterday's problem and after the market has already moved on.
Brilliant. So we've now identified the warning signs, we've challenged some of the biggest myths around pivoting, but there's still one important question. If the evidence is sitting right in front of us, why do founders still struggle to make the decision? That's exactly what we'll explore next as Amy walks us through the psychological traps that keep startups stuck. And as I said, we've identified the warning signs and we've challenged some of the biggest myths around pivoting. But here's something I've always wondered. If the evidence is sitting right in front of the founders, why don't they act? Amy, why do intelligent founders still delay making the decision to pivot?
It's such a good question. And honestly, it has very little to do with their intelligence. It has everything to do with their psychology. Every founder begins their startup, obviously, with a lot of optimism. You have to. Nobody starts a business expecting it to fail. Otherwise, we just never would start businesses. But that same optimism can sometimes be your biggest blind spot. And today, I'm going to share 6 psychological traps that quietly keep startups stuck. So, trap 1, the sunk cost trap. So, founders say, we've already spent 2 years building this. You've invested your savings, you've hired a team, you've sacrificed evenings and weekends. So obviously, naturally, you're going to feel that walking away would have wasted all of that effort. But the market actually doesn't care how much you've already invested. Customers don't buy products because they took years to build. They buy products because they solve their problem today. One of the hardest leadership lessons is learning that yesterday's investment should never decide your strategy for tomorrow.
So it's not about giving up on the work you've already done. It's about making sure future decisions are based on current evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. So successful founders don't need to protect their past decisions. They need to protect their future opportunities. So trap 2 is the emotional attachment. And people often say that this is a product that I've always dreamt of building. And whilst that's understandable, customers don't fall in love with our vision. They fall in love with their own problems. The question founders should ask isn't, do I love this product? It's, why would my customer miss this product if it disappeared tomorrow? So the third trap is one I see constantly. It's the growth illusion. The company says we're getting more users. Everything must be fine, but that's not necessarily true. Imagine your customer base doubles, but only 20% actually stay. Have you grown, or have you just simply increased your marketing budget? Growth without retention is just extensive optimism.
Yeah, and another point to consider for anybody watching is which metric do you think founders ignore most often? A, revenue, B, customer retention, C, customer feedback, or D, profitability? Again, share your answers if you're online.
So let's move on to the fourth trap, and that's external pressure. People often worry about what will investors think if we do pivot. And here's what I've kind of seen from other founders. Most investors aren't disappointed when the founders do change direction. They're disappointed when founders ignore very clear evidence that they should change. Investors understand markets change, and what concerns them is that the leadership refuses to adapt based on that change. The fifth trap is probably my favorite, the busy trap. People often say, we've never worked harder. Well, being busy doesn't automatically mean that you're making progress. You don't want to be a busy fool. You can spend months building features that nobody actually requested. You can attend meetings all day and you can work 14 hours every day, but you're still moving away further from the product market fit. Activity and progress just aren't the same thing. And then finally, the ego trap. So again, founders will say, I know my market better than my customers know it. And this is a dangerous mindset because every single customer votes every day, not with their words, but with their behavior. And they decide whether they want to return. They decide whether they want to pay or whether they want to recommend you to someone else. And the market rewards that relevance and not just the ego and the confidence that the founders have.
I think that's one of the most powerful points today. Sometimes the biggest obstacle isn't competition, it's our own assumptions.
Yeah, 100%. I think that the strongest founders have to stay curious. They can't just assume that they're always right. They have to keep thinking, what am I learning today? What is the market teaching me today?
Brilliant. So we've explored why founders delay difficult decisions. Now let's look at what happens when that delay continues, the cost of waiting. Now everyone, you're now members of a startup advisory board. 2 companies have approached you for advice. Both have 6 months of cash runway remaining. Your task isn't to judge them. Your task is to decide what should they do next.
So let's begin. We've got company A, ShopSense AI. On the surface, their customer acquisition is increasing. Sounds positive. But then we discover something really important. Only 25% actually renew, and the customers repeatedly just use one feature, and then the marketing costs keep rising, which means that the revenue barely moves. So despite all of that, the teams still want to build 5 more features. So the question for everyone would be, would building be the way to go to solve the problem? Or would it simply make the product a lot more complicated?
Yeah, so one to think about. Would you recommend to continue building or stop and investigate why customers only value one feature?
Yeah, exactly. So the real problem here isn't the customer acquisition. The real problem is the customer value. And more features rarely solve the poor products focus.
Now, let's compare that with company B.
So company B is very different. Their growth has slowed down. And at first glance, that obviously sounds worrying. But then we look at it a bit deeper. 92% customer retention. So customers are actively requesting integrations. The revenue is continuing to grow, which are very healthy signals. but this company doesn't necessarily need to pivot. It needs disciplined execution. Maybe they need stronger partnerships, or maybe a gradual expansion. Not every slowdown in a business requires changing the direction.
So one company needs to rethink its strategy, and the other simply needs to improve execution.
100%. So one of the biggest mistakes that founders make is confusing every problem with a pivot opportunity. And sometimes your strategy is wrong, but sometimes your execution is too. And it's your job to know the difference. So the key learning is the cost of waiting isn't always measured in money. Sometimes it's measured in the missed opportunities and the lost customers, or just generally the exhausted teams that you have and the months spent building something that no one actually really wants.
So once we've identified the right direction, how do founders actually make the transition successfully? Moving on to the smart pivot framework. Amy, you've shared a lot about recognizing when change is needed. Now let's focus on the practical side of things. How should founders actually approach a pivot?
Yeah, this is a great framework because it's really practical. A pivot shouldn't have to feel really chaotic. It needs to feel disciplined. So let's walk through these 8 steps. So step 1 is recognizing the warning signs. Everything begins with awareness. You don't want to ignore declining retention or changing customer behaviors or shrinking margins. Your metrics are trying to tell you something. Step 2 is listening to customers. Stop guessing what they're thinking, just start asking. Customer interviews often reveal insights that analytics just won't alone. Step 3 is analyzing that data. So separate the opinions from the actual facts. Look at your retention, your customer acquisition costs, your revenue, your product engagement. The data removes the emotion from decision making. Step 4 is choosing the right pivot. So remember that not every pivot changes your entire company. Sometimes you need to change your target market, the pricing, or just one feature, but you need to be really precise. Step 5 is test before you actually commit. Don't just rebuild your entire company overnight. You need to run experiments. You need to launch pilots. You need to validate your idea before you invest heavily and change everything. Step 6 is aligning your team. So your employees should never hear about your pivot on LinkedIn, for example. You need to communicate it early and explain why you're actually pivoting so you can help everyone understand the new direction. Step 5 is then measuring and refining. So you need to treat your pivot like it's an ongoing experiment. Measure your results, learn, adjust, and then repeat. And then finally, scale what works. Only after validation do you scale. Growth should always follow evidence and not assumptions.
I really like that this framework doesn't encourage founders to move quickly just for the sake of it. It encourages thoughtful, evidence-based decisions.
Yeah, exactly. The stronger startups don't pivot because they're failing. They pivot because they're learning faster than the market is actually changing. And that's the difference between reacting and then leading.
Brilliant. So we've now explored the psychology behind pivoting, the cost of waiting, and a practical framework for making strategic changes. To bring everything together, Amy has prepared one final case study where you'll once again step into the role of a CEO. Let's see how you would handle one of the most important decisions a founder can make. Learn Loop AI. What would you do if you were the CEO? So we've covered the theory, we've explored the warning signs, we've discussed the founder psychology. Now it's time to put everything together. As I said, Amy's prepared one final case study, and this time I'd like everyone watching to imagine they're sitting in the CEO chair. Amy, over to you.
Thank you so much. So everyone, meet Learn Loop AI. So this is an AI-powered learning platform created for university students. The founders have a very ambitious vision. And instead of solving one problem, they want to solve almost every single student's problem. The platform includes a AI tutor. It's got assignment planning, study notes, career guidance, and then several other learning tools. From the founder's perspective, this looks like a complete solution. And honestly, that many founders begin this exact way, and they try to become everything for everyone.
And on paper, that sounds like a fantastic product.
It does. But then let's fast forward 18 months. The company has over 120,000 registered users. At first glance, this obviously sounds really impressive, but let's look beneath the surface. Only 19% of users remain active every single month. The customer acquisition costs have increased by 65%. Subscription renewals have fallen to just 28%. And here's the most interesting number. More than 80% of active users consistently use only one feature, and that's the AI tutor.
So, despite having multiple products, customers are only finding value in one.
Yeah, exactly. So now imagine you're the CEO, you've raised funding, you've hired a talented team, and then you've invested months of building all of these additional features. What would you actually choose to do? Would you continue investing in every feature because you've already built them? Or would you focus entirely on one thing that the customers are clearly valuing?
So, yeah, CEOs out there, time to get your thinking hats on. If you were the CEO, what would your next move be? Would you A, continue improving every feature? B, reduce marketing and wait? C, focus entirely on the AI tutor? Or D, raise more funding before making any changes? Just some points to consider there. And if you're watching online, pop your answers in the chat.
I think the point here is that there isn't always one perfect answer. Well, I want you to notice one thing. The founders did something that changed everything. Instead of making another assumption, they actually interviewed over 150 customers. And those conversations completely changed their understanding of their business. Customers weren't asking for another all-in-one learning platform. They simply wanted the fastest and most reliable AI tutor available. The founders realized that they weren't building the wrong technology. They were just trying to solve too many problems at once.
So the real pivot wasn't the technology, it was the focus.
Yeah, 100%. That one sentence changed the future for the entire company. Customers don't pay you for every single thing that you build. They pay you for the problem that you solve the best. And I think that is one of the biggest lessons that today's webinar actually offers. Your customers will often tell you where your business should go. And the challenge is always, are you willing to listen to them? So I'd like everyone to think about your own startup. If you removed 70% of your product tomorrow, what would actually remain? Because whatever remains, that's probably where your greatest value already exists.
That was such a practical example, thank you. And I think many founders watching today will recognise themselves somewhere in that story. We've now reached our discussion section. If you've been taking notes throughout today's webinar, now is the perfect time to ask your questions. And Amy, whilst we let our audience have a think about any questions, I've got a few to ask myself. So first one is, what's the biggest mistake you see first-time founders make when deciding whether to pivot?
I think it's about confusing activity with progress. So a lot of founders believe that working harder automatically means that they're moving closer to success. And sometimes it's the absolute opposite. The harder that you work on the wrong strategy, the further that you move away from being successful. The most successful founders regularly stop and ask, is this still the right problem to actually solve?
Brilliant. If a founder is completely unsure whether they should pivot, where should they start?
It's absolutely talking to your customers, and not just talking to them once, talk to them all the time. Customer interviews obviously reveal patterns that your analytics dashboards never can. So don't ask your customers whether they liked your product, ask them how they're currently solving their problem. And that's where the real insights usually appear.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you. And another question for you. Can founders pivot too often?
Absolutely. So pivoting isn't supposed to be every single month. That's not a great strategy. It's just confusion. So a pivot should always follow evidence that you found and not just emotion. You need to gather the information, you need to validate your assumptions, and then you can make one deliberate decision and then give it enough time to actually produce any sort of measurable results.
Makes sense. And another one for you. If there's one sentence you'd like founders to remember after today's webinar, what would it be?
I definitely say don't become emotionally attached to your solution. Becoming deeply committed to solving the customer's problem is the best way to be successful. Every solution evolves and customers' problems remain remarkably consistent.
Yeah, not becoming emotionally attached, I think is a real key, isn't it? And sometimes I think easier said than done when you've got something that's you're really passionate about and have been working on for years, but really critical. And that's a wonderful way to summarize today's discussion. So before we finish, I'd like to briefly introduce an opportunity for founders who are ready to take the next step in their entrepreneurial journey.
So everything that we've discussed today, customer discovery, product validation, strategic decision-making, and building your sustainable business, these aren't one-time conversations that we have. They're constantly ongoing to improve founder skills. And that's exactly why programs like the LSET Startup Incubator actually exists. So the incubator provides founders with structured support as they move from that idea to actually execution. You'll have opportunities to refine your business model. You'll receive expert mentoring from your one and only, validate your product with experienced professionals, and then prepare for funding conversations. And you will also become part of a growing entrepreneurial community. So if today's webinar has encouraged you to think differently about your startup, I'd really recommend and encourage you to explore the LSET program. So you can scan the QR code on the screen or you can visit the website to learn more.
And I definitely encourage everyone to have a look. Learning doesn't stop when today's webinar ends. Sometimes one conversation, one mentor, or one piece of customer feedback can completely change the future of your business. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. On behalf of the London School of Emerging Technology, thank you so much for joining us, and a very special thank you to Amy for sharing such practical and thought-provoking insights. Amy, before we close, would you like to leave our audience with one final message?
I'd absolutely love to. So founders often believe that success comes with a perfect idea. And I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think success comes from building the willingness to learn faster than your competitors are. Every startup obviously begins with assumptions, and the founders who succeed are the ones that are willing to test those assumptions. We want you to challenge them and, when necessary, change direction. But remember, a pivot isn't about admitting that you were wrong. It's about becoming more aligned with what your customers truly need. So if today's session inspires you to ask better questions and have deeper customer conversations, and then make decisions based on evidence rather than just emotions, then we've achieved exactly what we hoped for. So thank you so much for all your time, your participation, and thoughtful questions, Kelly. And I wish every one of you the best on your startup journey.
Thank you once again, Amy, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. If you found this session valuable, we'd love for you to share your feedback and continue following the LSET webinar series for more discussions with founders, entrepreneurs, and industry experts. Have a wonderful day wherever you're joining us from. Stay curious,